We're letting people in.
I think we can start. Is everyone all right? Yeah.
Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our session. I'm just going to begin with a couple of house rules. So translation is available in this Zoom. If you click on the bottom of your screen at the interpretation button, you should see English, French, and Spanish. So please select whichever language is applicable to you and we can get started. Also, the chat feature for this Zoom will be open. So please, let's just make sure that this is a safe space for all identities and all persons. So in any commentary that is entered into the chat, please do be respectful. So it looks like we have several people in the Zoom now, so I think we can go ahead and get started with today's discussion. So hi, everybody. My name is Bhumika. I'm a global policy advocate with the International Center for Research on Women and the North America organizing partner of the Women's Major Group. I'm excited to welcome you to our session today on gender equality, systemic challenges, and inequalities. As the Women's Major Group, we're really proud to be one of the co-organizers of this week's Global People's Assembly. The Global People's Assembly provides a space for all participants to review social, environmental, and economic inequalities, to plan and develop collaborative actions towards systemic change, and to advance commitments made under the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Climate Agreement. With 23 organizers from around the world, this initiative builds upon the People's Assembly of 2019, where 300 participants from 80 countries produced the 2019 Declaration. Today's session is co-led by the Women's Major Group, Women Engaged for a Common Future, Global Coalition Against Poverty, and the Asia Dalit Rights Forum. Our discussion today will be focused on intersectionality and gender equality and the need for systemic change to challenge existing and growing inequalities. We have a really incredible panel of speakers today, but before we start, I'd like to draw your attention to the Miro board that my colleagues will be running on the screen. So there you go, it's just popped up. So on this Miro board, we'll be populating this collectively throughout the session to help us map out different systems of oppression, related inequalities, and the issues that each of our speakers will be outlining in their commentary today. Today's session will be interactive, so we'll be seeking inputs and questions from the audience to help guide our discussion. So to start, we'd like to ask the audience, utilizing the chat function on your screens, to answer the following question: which systems of oppression are you trying to overcome? So I'll allow your responses to come in, and my colleagues will make sure that they're reflected on the Miro board as we begin the discussion. So great, patriarchy is an overarching system of oppression throughout this. So any other caste discrimination is also coming in, access to education and employment, neoliberalism. There are lots of others. I'll allow people a moment to brainstorm. Toxic masculinity, great. Corporate domination, economic systems. Great, we have nationalism, militarism, racism, capitalism. Give it a couple more seconds in case there are more thoughts. Great, access to freedom of assembly. Great, extractivism and neo-colonial systems. Great, so it looks like we've got a lot of great inputs. So there isn't room for all of them on the board, but we've just started with a few here that are now featured on the Miro board, and we'll be updating this throughout the discussion. So our various speakers will discuss different topics relevant to their work and their advocacy and rights-based activism that seek to dismantle these different forms of systems of oppression. So throughout this discussion, we'll update and create links and make sure that all of the commentary raised by our speakers hits on different points, so that by the end of this discussion, we'll have a mapping out of different systems of oppression, different rights issues, and hopefully through the discussion, some commentary on how to approach these. So I'll move along with that to each of our speakers. And I'm first going to pass it over to Bhumika to talk to us about gender and macroeconomics. So we can start at a bit of a larger level and then go into different specific issues. So Bhumika, if you could shortly introduce yourself and your organization and then talk to us about women and macroeconomics. I'll pass the mic over to you.
Hello, hi, greetings. My name is Bhumika Muchhala, and I am speaking to you from Third World Network, where I lead the work on global economic justice, advocacy, research and analysis, and looking at the various macro policy impacts of the COVID pandemic, as well as the ways in which structural drivers of global economic inequalities are falling most predominantly on women's shoulders. So to begin with, we are looking at a global scenario where the COVID pandemic has reproduced and exacerbated inequalities on every single dimension, layer, and level. We are seeing a continuation and an absolute explosion of debt colonialism. The ways in which developing countries are increasingly dependent and impacted by debt crises, debt distress, where so many developing countries are spending more of their scarce and precious public resources to repay external debt, to repay private creditors and international lenders over and above financing their own economic and health recovery needs, even in the midst of a pandemic. So we see that the true depth and urgency of this pandemic is being borne by women, especially poor women at the crossfires of intersectional inequalities of race, caste, class, and ability and sexuality around the world. We see that the depths of the shadow pandemic can only be revealed by looking clearly at how at least 50 million women will be pushed into extreme poverty. And it is these women who are the shock absorbers of the debt to austerity cycle being reenacted across the global South in yet another lost decade, which the UN has been calling out with the new publication of the Trade and Development Report this year in 2021, where it is documented that at least 41 developing countries actually reduced their public expenditures in 2020 alone, and dozens more developing countries will be reducing their public spending even further, even as their public debt keeps mounting and is structurally working against the very regions that are most vulnerable in terms of climate change impacts, such as small islands and countries that are commodity and raw materials export dependent. So we see that the debt and austerity cycle is well in play and will be impacting the countries that are most vulnerable. We know that 70% of health workers are women. We know that women have borne the care economy burdens, that closures of schools and childcare services are entirely assumed by the unpaid contribution of women, and austerity measures are hitting public services as never before. We also know that the domestic and care work has once again absorbed the shock to public systems, is once again the largest subsidy to the global economy, and is once again exacerbating and continuing the persistent sexual division of labor. At the very core, this shows how the economic system is deeply patriarchal. While women face violence at home, lose jobs, are burdened with unpaid care work, and are entering informal work more than ever, The rich pocket the profits. Billionaires increase their fortunes by around 10.2 trillion last year in 2020. We see the financial markets are absolutely booming. We see speculative financial flows in a private first privatization, public-private partnership agenda being absolutely expanded. And this juxtaposed next to the estimation of the value of women's unpaid care work at around exactly the same 10.8 trillion annually. So we see the juxtaposition where women truly are lifting up the entire global economy. I wanted to just quickly focus on three key ways that fiscal austerity in particular is impacting gender equality and women. The first way is the cuts and caps on the public wage bill, which is at the center of public systems. Public systems ought to be seen as the most core aspect of feminist fiscal justice, as the majority of health and education workers in developing countries are women, are funded by the public wage bill, and even in a pandemic are facing serious shortages of public sector workers for a just recovery. The second channel of fiscal austerity is the reductions in social protection safety nets, or even what is commonly used by the IMF today in their loan programs is in particular temporary and targeted cash transfers. And we need to call out the inadequacy of such cash transfers in light of the universal and permanent social protection systems and floors that are actually needed. Another key method is privatization of healthcare and pensions. A third channel that is extremely important is, of course, regressive income taxes, in particular value-added taxes and general sales taxes, which are indirect consumption taxes that disproportionately affect low-income women, children, and households. And these are not new. These have been in place for a long time. And we see today that the gender equity channels of these measures are deeply political. They are being enacted in order to make the debt repayments to international creditors in order to meet the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank's definition of what debt sustainability is according to their calculations of what the debt ceilings ought to be, what the maximum targets of the fiscal deficit ought to be, what the inflation target ought to be, how much is considered debt unsustainable, and what crosses the line. So we need to challenge the very colonial production of knowledge that goes into determining these economic categories and boundaries. So we know what the impacts are throughout the years. We know the lost livelihoods and incomes. We know the ways in which women's work is overburdened. So the recommendations in particular have to be centered around reformulating the economy so that care work is at the very center of what is defined as production. Care work is recognized as the largest subsidy to the economy and central to production, that production is not just waged work, it is also the reproductive work. And we need to recognize the formulation of an economy where women act as the economic shock absorbers. Women are paying the price for the public budget cuts. And this is where a new economic architecture is very much needed. We need for the UN to enact a new global economic architecture through a revamped effort at the Financing for Development process that the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development has also been very much calling for, where fiscal space, policy space is really addressed, where tax justice reforms and the central role that the UN ought to play in the multilateral reforms is addressed. So the work of the Financing for Development process is more important than ever, more urgent than ever. And it is a time to really confront the failures of multilateralism, especially for people and planet, but to really tackle the construction of the social hierarchy that is patriarchy and unequal gender relations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhumika, for your really powerful commentary. We've placed a lot of your notes around neoliberal capitalism and the Miro board, but it was clear from everything you mentioned how interlocking these systems of oppression are and all of the intersecting issues that you raised throughout your commentary on debt colonialism and austerity. You've hit on nearly every point on our board already, which really drives the point forward that these systems of oppression are all linked together, that they're all exacerbating key rights issues, and that they all need to be addressed front on. So really applauding your point on the need for a new economic architecture, and want us to keep that in mind as we move forward through the discussion. So thank you again. And I'm going to move now to Mishy from FEMNET to speak to us about women and climate change. So Mishy, over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
All right, and apologies, I have a very weak internet. But yeah, my name is Mwanahamisi Singano. I work with FEMNET as head of program, and I'm really passionate about climate change and climate justice in particular. And thank you, Bhumika, for setting up the context and literally saying most of what I would say, but you have said it better. So I think to start, I would wish to quote the African Feminist Charter of Principle, which has said and echoed, to challenge patriarchy effectively also requires to challenge other systems of oppression and exploitation, which frequently mutually reinforce and support each other. And in the context, that's where we're having this conversation, because there is that acknowledgement that patriarchy as a system really work with other systems of oppression to reinforce those systems. And specifically, climate change, as we know it, is a product of the patriarchal capitalist economic system built on destruction and of exploitation of human and nature. And with capitalism as a model of production and an economic model is what bred climate change. And exploitation of women, for example, is part and parcel of the broader process of exploitation. So addressing climate change is addressing systematic system of oppression, which, as I said, reinforce each other. At the center of it is a capitalist as a mode of production. And because those systems has worked together, capitalism in this case, and exploitation of women, we know now, for those who have worked in climate change, we know the famous saying that women are most impacted by climate change is evident. Research has shown over and over again when, for example, crisis hit, women are more impacted. UNDP, for example, did projectors suggest that women may be 14 times more likely to die in a climate disaster. And the evidence across the board that women have, that's the fact that we have established. And the quest for the feminists is to move beyond those facts of women are being affected the most, to understand why women have been affected, because you cannot understand it by just saying that women are the most impacted, but looking at the system of oppression that linked gender inequality and gender exploitation with exploitation of nature as well. But also we do know as an evidence of how these two systems reinforce each other. We do know, for example, women are not in a decision table in any of climate change policy process, being it in the UNFCCC or being it in a national policy processes. Women are not in that table. Majority of those who are making policy and taking decisions on behalf of the world are not women. And that's part of the systematic problem, exploitation that we are seeing. And because of that, the policy and decisions that have been made, programs that have been designed, doesn't reflect the needs of women. And if so, it treats women as passive agent of change. It just makes them survive the system and not altering relations of power and not transforming communities and women. But also we do know, as a matter of fact, because of those interlinkages in the system, we do know, for example, as of now, the climate finance doesn't finance women. I think there is a couple of research that have said clearly that resources that goes to women are very minimal. Even in a climate change finance, the project that ought to support women, most of them doesn't have gender as a primary or principal objective, but rather it has it as, for example, a mainstreaming. And as the result of that, most resources doesn't target women. And this is just an additional evidence to the systematic exploitation. And last, I think it has been said with previous speaker, that women knowledge, skills, is not considered as a solution to climate crisis. And it has been undervalued, it has been exploited. And because of that, we are fighting the crisis, lifting half of the world population. We are fighting the crisis without half of the world population. So I think moving forward, as we understand the interlinkages between gender and women, specifically with the climate change, but also the system of oppression, I think we can, as I said, we cannot solve climate crisis if we constantly keep pushing women at the periphery of power. The world won't be able to solve climate crisis and any crisis in that matter. We just had how, for example, COVID crisis, because systematically we continue to push women at the periphery of power and not altering the power relation and making us as community, but also nature, vulnerable to changes. So I think moving forward, what we'll need to do, and I think that is clear, I personally believe that with all wisdom vested in humans, we can envision to build a just, stable, and sustainable and dignified world. Feminists have started that journey. We have envisioning the alternative world. We have been calling for system change, but we do know that the privilege and the greed are still resisting it because they still want to exploit and extract the world to its last oxygen if possible. They think, I think, in my view, that the billions of money that they have in the bank, they will be able to serve them, even though the evidence clearly suggests that we are not safe, all of us, regardless of how much resources you have accumulated for yourself. And it is in everyone's interest to address the inequalities and change the system of oppression to attain a dignified, just, and sustainable world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. So we've placed climate change and climate justice at the intersection of colonialism and extractivism on the board, but you've raised so many different linkages to patriarchy, to capitalism, and to other systems of oppression that are all highlighted in your remarks. So I want to link some of what you raised to what Bhumika also mentioned in her commentary about how we know what the impacts are. And as you raised, Mishy, women are maybe 14 times more likely to die in climate disaster, yet they're not part of decision making. And as you said, so meaningfully, women are at the periphery of power, and so long as they remain in those positions, our solutions will continue to lag. So I want to pass it now to Martha to speak to us about the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on women with disabilities in particular. So Martha, if you could please introduce yourself and your organization and speak to us more about this issue. I'll pass the mic to you. I'm not sure if you're having some trouble. Martha, are you able to unmute?
Spokesman, I'm not able to see Martha in the participant list. Maybe we can skip her and come back to her later.
Sure. So I'll pass it now to Asitan, who's also going to be speaking about women with disabilities. So Asitan, if you're on, please go ahead.
Excuse me, maybe there's a problem of the language. Assistant, vous êtes là? Est-ce que vous pouvez parler maintenant?
Allô?
Oh, allô, oui.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui, oui, c'est bien. OK.
Ah oui, d'accord. Donc, bonjour tout le monde.
Bonjour.
Allô, oui? Bonjour tout le monde.
Bonjour, allez-y.
Oui, d'accord. Donc, mon intervention sera axée sur les remerciements et les félicitations à l'endroit de GCAB Global pour l'appui et l'assistance apportée à notre association. C'est grâce à cela que nous, femmes en situation de handicap, membres de mon association au Mali, avons eu un éveil de conscience et nous a permis de nous battre pour l'aboutissement de notre lutte. En fait, au Mali, depuis des décennies, nous, association des personnes en situation de handicap, dont j'en suis un acteur principal, n'avons cessé de nous battre. Nous n'avons jamais baissé les bras pour aboutir notre combat. C'est finalement sous cette pression que le gouvernement du Mali a voté, et plus précisément le 12 juin 2018, une loi en faveur des droits des personnes en situation de handicap. Mais, il y a mais, parce que le gouvernement a voté la loi, mais n'était pas de bonne foi, puisqu'il a refusé de signer le décret d'application. Or, sans ce décret d'application, la loi est une coquille vide de contenu. La loi est impossible d'être appliquée. Donc, il va falloir vraiment attendre un peu plus tard que nous, à notre rencontre à l'Assemblée générale des peuples à New York en septembre 2019, que sur invitation de GCAB Global, l'opportunité nous a été offerte vraiment de nous exprimer devant le peuple, de lancer un cri de cœur, et ce qui va apporter fruit. Et là aussi, je rends un hommage particulier à notre directeur, M. Ingo, qui pour son engagement, son attachement personnel, nous a accordé cette faveur de nous exprimer devant les parlementaires de New York. Vraiment, ça nous a rapporté un grand fruit. À mon retour au pays, j'ai fait le compte rendu fidèle aux membres de mes associations. Et aussi, j'ai noué des contacts avec d'autres associations, les leaders d'associations. Main dans la main, nous avons conjugué nos efforts vraiment pour relancer le dossier pour que le décret d'application puisse quand même voir le jour. Et finalement, le décret d'application vient d'être signé le 1er septembre 2021. Là, je rends encore un hommage sincère et particulier à GCAB Global et plus particulièrement à M. Ingo. Je vous dis franchement que moi qui vous parle, moi je suis une intellectuelle. J'ai mon master en macroéconomie, j'ai mon master en gestion et je suis inspecteur des finances au niveau du ministère de l'économie et des finances. Pour vous dire par là que ma compétence intellectuelle ne fait pas défaut. Mais quand je quitte le cercle du service quand je quitte le cercle professionnel pour intégrer les autres femmes dans la ville, j'étais complexée compte tenu de mon handicap parce que je voyais les autres femmes, elles étaient debout sur 2 pieds. Moi, étant handicapée, je ne voulais même pas intégrer vraiment le groupe, aussi bien que les autres membres de mon association. Mais je vous dis très franchement que après la rencontre de New York, j'ai eu une fierté, un sentiment de fierté qui m'a animée. Aussi, quand je suis allée aussi à Victoria Falls, que l'occasion m'a été offerte de m'exprimer devant les peuples, je vous dis très franchement que présentement, pour moi, il n'y a aucun fossé entre moi et les autres femmes valides. Ça, quand même, ça, il ne faut même pas douter de cela. Donc, pour là, je viens vraiment remercier encore une fois de plus ITACH-MAAKI pour tout ce qu'ils ont eu à faire et pour moi. Je vous remercie. Allô?
Thank you so much. Yes.
Allô?
Yes, thank you so much for your commentary. Really appreciate what you've mentioned around women with disabilities in Mali, and also the process that you outlined around the process with the government and enforcing the law. So we've placed here some of the issues that you've mentioned around ableism as the systems of oppression, and also linked it, of course, to various other systems of oppression outlined on the Miro board, including classism, patriarchy, capitalism, other issues that you mentioned in your remarks. So I will pass it along to our next speaker. So I don't think Martha is on the line still, so perhaps we'll wait a little bit longer for her, but I'll go over to Bina of the Asia Dalit Rights Forum to speak to us about women and violence against women. So Bina, if you could please introduce yourself and speak to us about your work. Over to you.
Okay.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, great. So my name is Bina Palikal and I'm with the Asia Dalit Rights Forum. It's a collective of organizations and networks working on the ground with Dalit women and of course the Dalit community in general in accessing both public entitlements as well as looking at policy level changes, both nationally, regionally, and globally. I'd like to really thankful to be here and heard a lot from the last few speakers. My focus is going to be on Dalit women in the region, looking at the situation. All of us, I think, have heard of the system of caste. That's a very oppressive system. I think many of us have heard of it. Many of us know of it. I also come from the community, so many of us have also faced what it means to be a Dalit woman in this region. But specifically looking at the fact that if you look in India, a young girl recently, about 9 years old, walked a little bit away from home, and a temple priest raped and killed her. And when the mother came asking her for looking for her, this is what he told her. He said that you need to shut up because you have no political clout, you don't know anybody, and you are poor, and this is not going to go anywhere. The audacity of that man is basically what is casteism. This is what caste does to you. This is how caste gives you that privilege to say those things, because he knows that as Dalits, we cannot. So he even told her, you better be silent, don't make a complaint, because if you make a complaint, you will not have money to fight this case. You'll not have people, you'll not have lawyers, etc., etc. The audacity with which he made this statement is what we face on a daily basis across the region. In India, there are several policies that are there to address it, but it still continues unabated. There are about, on an average, there are about 5,000 rapes in a year. And if you break it down, there are about 10 rape. Every day, there are 10 Dalit women raped by the end of the day or within 24 hours. This is the situation in India. If you go to Nepal, Nepal also has very good laws, but there too violence continues on Dalit women. The fact is that many people have asked over the last few years that when we talk about violence, why do you want to mention that it is a Dalit woman? Let's just say that it is a woman who's been violated. But the fact is that most of these cases of rape and violence on Dalit women are because she's a Dalit woman. If it is like a young girl went to fetch water from the well and she was raped, or a young girl went out to relieve herself and she was raped, or a young girl was going to the school uh, to access education and she was raped. So most of the time, the rape is not just only because of her gender, but also because of the fact that she comes from a particular caste, she comes from a particular class. That's why this violence or this rape happens. In countries like Bangladesh, it's not even recognized. So, or in Sri Lanka, many of the plantation workers are from the Dalit community and they're not recognized as Dalit. So, on one level, in some countries in South Asia, we're still looking and fighting for that recognition. On the other level, in countries like India, Nepal, maybe Pakistan as well, we do have laws that address it. We do have specific laws that say that caste is a system that's practiced, and there are laws to prevent it. The other thing I'd also like to cover upon is that it is not just physical violence, it is also how can I say, economic violence, where because of the fact that we are poor, because of the fact that we come from a certain caste, opportunities to us also do not come. So there are several barriers that are created in accessing justice and accessing public entitlements, in just accessing basic rights, right to civic amenities, right to health. During the COVID, which had a huge impact on the communities, and specifically on Dalit women, because we just couldn't access healthcare, because there was not even a small amount of social security that they could access. And I think some of these things run across gender, but I think some of these things we need to say that it's specific, because many of these women are not poor because of anything else, but they're poor because they did not have access to education, or they did not have access to access to an education or access to healthcare for so many years. In India, for example, there are budgetary allocations and there are schemes specifically for Dalit women. However, what is really missing in this region is that although there are policies, that the implementation of these policies are absolutely poor, and because of that the impact is much more higher on the women. If you take any human development indicators, the Dalit women fare the lowest. Dalit children die of malnutrition even before the age of 2. The numbers are much more higher as compared to the national averages in many of these countries in the region. Therefore, what does sustainable development goals really mean to us? We cannot look at goal 5 as as a separate goal. We have to interconnect it with all the other goals, because it's important to have health rights, important to have housing, it's important to have access to clean drinking water. And one of the most shameful practices that today I feel is one of the most uh, I would say a dire situation for Dalit women is women engaged in manual scavenging, which is still which is a huge problem in this country. It's a shame on this country, and I think that um, there has to be something done, because that is such an old system of even functioning, and many of these women continue to do this generation after generation. So there comes the intergenerational poverty that continues, and then their children also. Hello, I can hear the French trans, sorry. And therefore we need to understand that to be able to get women out of manual scavenging, or to get women out of some of these heinous practices that still exist, like the Devdasi systems, which is temple prostitution, where Dalit women are taken as temple prostitutes. I think these are some of the very heinous practices that are traditionally happening, and people in some way, the privileged don't want to talk about it because it serves their purpose. So why talk about it if we want, if it works out for some of us? So I think that my suggestions and recommendations to all the feminist organizations here, that we have to look at the future of sustainable development goal, and the future and not just as a feminist future, but as an intersectional future. And what does intersectionality mean? That we cannot formulate policies, or we cannot look at implementation, both the SDGs at the global level as well as regional and national, without keeping women at the center of the discourse, and without keeping women from these different intersectionalities, whether it be Dalit women, whether it be indigenous women, whether it be minority women, other marginalized women, women with disabilities. We have to keep them at the center of the planning and implementation, without which we cannot we cannot address it. We all know that COVID has had a huge impact on women, the migrant women, most of whom are from the Dalit community and from the caste oppressed communities, have found it extremely difficult to make ends meet. But what is the government doing? What can we push UN agencies and to push the governments to actually have something like a social security system in these countries where women are almost left helpless. So therefore, I'd conclude by saying that let us not look at just violence as in physical violence, but let's also look at what are the systematic ways that oppression and discrimination takes place, both by the system or by the state as well as the non-state actors. And let's ensure that while we are talking, and while we're demanding access, an equitable and sustainable future, let's demand that these women are kept at the center while we formulate policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bina, for your comments. Those were really powerful, and we've tried to outline them a little bit here along the patriarchy system of oppression on our board, and have linked it to several other issues. So really appreciate a lot of the comments you raised around how it's not just physical violence, but economic violence and different types of violence are also imposed upon women and vulnerable populations. You raised really important points about budgetary allocations, the role of the state, the specific effects that lack of education and healthcare also has on women, and how it further exacerbates their vulnerabilities. And really second your call at the end to make sure that women are at the center of all decision making. So I'm going to pass it now to Aisha Lovely George from the Hidden Pockets Collective to speak about women and decriminalization. So Aisha, please introduce yourself and your work, and I'll pass it on to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Aisha Lovely George, and I'm the executive coordinator at Hidden Pockets Collective, and I'm also the counselor there. So in last 3 years, I have personally handled and counseled more than 3,000 young women and couples who wanted to access safe abortion in India. And I helped them in making sure that they have a good experience while accessing safe abortion in a clinic, and also services related to sexual and reproductive health. Today, I would be talking about women and decriminalization. Criminalization defines what is illegal and accordingly punishes a person for not following a law. And today I would be talking about abortion as one of the activity which is seen as punishable. So I would also like to give some context about my country, India, where if a woman seeks for safe abortion facility beyond a prescribed legal conditions and duration, then it is seen that this woman is, going forward and doing something illegal. And even if this woman gets the permission from the law, because she is under that, legal duration, if still she goes and access safe abortion, the patriarchal society still sees this woman as a person who has done a big sin. As in India, it's a huge stigma. We have a huge stigma around having premarital sex, and also thinking about women who would go forward and have safe access to safe abortion. So our law, which provides for safe abortion, it's called the MTP Act, Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act 1971, is almost 50 years now. And I would like to tell you that majority of the women don't know that such law exists. And here I'm talking about women who are highly educated and economically well off. Even most of them don't know that this law exists. And this year we had few amendments in this law. And I'm sure because during last year, COVID, I was speaking to a lot of doctors when I had to send young people to so that they can get safe, access to safe abortion. The doctors also did not know that there are some few amendment made, and they were not ready to believe that these amendments are made because of the stigma around abortion, about young women getting involved in premarital sex. So people are not actually willing to give the rights to women to have this service. And lack of knowledge.
Aisha, if you could speak a bit loudly, we're having some trouble hearing.
Okay. Am I loud now?
It sounds good to me.
Okay, thank you. So I would say due to lack of knowledge around the law about safe abortion, and because the society doesn't allow women to know about the laws also, women generally try to figure out different ways to access safe abortion. So most of the women end up with a quack, or might end up doing something which is very dangerous for them. So in this process, many of them have lost life. So in India, we have studies which shows that every day 13 women die due to complications due to unsafe abortion. And in my last 3 years, I have noticed that, if I talk about different areas, if I talk about finance, because women believe that it's illegal in our country because they don't know the laws, they end up in private organizations and they go to the doctors, where the doctors might know about the law, and they utilize this fact that this woman does not know, and they charge them around $1,000 for the first trimester. And I'm talking about women who might be first year college going, or might not be financially well, or might be still dependable on their parents, her parents for her finance. So these women cannot afford $1,000 for first trimester. So they move towards either take a loan from friend, or beg or borrow or steal just to go through this procedure. And I have also seen a lot of young women who are harassed, mentally harassed, and they go through a lot of mental torture, where they speak to us telling that, I think I'm not going to survive this situation, or I feel I'm a murderer. So you can see that how their mental health is also affected because of it. And also because they think it's illegal, they end up with quack. And I had a situation where this woman had to, she did not go to a doctor. She tried something at home and end up in a big, huge mistake. She was bleeding for 15 days. And on the 16th day, she went to the doctor, and the doctor asked her, why did you wait for 15 days bleeding? And then they had to operate, and then call the parents or relatives so that they can do some kind of operation and save this woman. And during COVID, it made it worse, because already we have stigma around abortion, and women don't openly tell that they want to access safe abortion. COVID made it sad for everyone, because even I have personal experience where I was talking to a doctor, and the doctor asked me that even during COVID, you young people want to have unprotected sex and want to access safe abortion. I mean, this is high time. You should stop all your stupid activities. So we can see that stigma just increased during COVID. So some say, I mean, we need to have laws, because if we don't have laws, then women would, tend to have a lot of abortion all the time, and there won't be any control, and we can't take care, women would not be able to take care of their health. But we have evidence that, I mean, nobody wants to go through a very long procedure of safe abortion. I mean, it affects you mentally, physically. And it's not that if we don't have a law, everybody will keep, all the women will keep doing abortion all the time. It's not true. So scaring women with laws won't help improving women's health. So we strongly believe that we need alternatives other than law. We need to provide education instead of having legal punishments. If we truly believe that we have to do something for women's sexual and reproductive health, that we need to figure out some other ways than punitive laws. So we believe that we need to be where women actually are, instead of expecting women to learn the laws by themselves and have information and go to the doctors. So we believe we need to be where women are, using different alternatives. Like, for example, for education, we can use the mainstream methods. I mean, using cinema, using audio podcasts, using music albums. Through these alternatives, we can provide useful and accurate information to all the women, so that they can understand the importance of health, and also understand that there is a legal support which they can have, and they can access safe abortion. So we have created a lot of audio podcasts where women who accessed safe abortion have spoken about their experience. The doctors who actually are pro-choice have given ideas and solutions how you can reach and access good organizations and public health centers, and how you can take care of yourself. So this is what my organization is doing. I mean, we believe that laws are good, but laws are not only the answers. We have to figure out some other way to provide education to women, so that they understand, everybody knows that health is important, but providing information in a beautiful way that it reaches everyone, and then they can get the accurate information and reach the providers and get good health. So that's what we believe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for your comments. That was really insightful. And we've tried to highlight some of the points that you've raised, near criminalization, militarism, and linking them to patriarchy, capitalism. And I also do appreciate some of the issues that you've raised around stigma and mental health, and the impacts that this has on women across the world. So I regret that some of our speakers, unfortunately, were unable to join us today, but we did have a speaker who was going to address women, peace, and security issues and dive deeper into militarism. So before I get into the Q&A portion of this event, I'll just point out that as the Women's Major Group in our work and advocacy, we really focus on militarism as one of the other systems of oppression, and the specific vulnerabilities that are faced by women in conflict and crisis, migrant women, refugee women and girls, and the barriers that they face in accessing their rights and protection. And of course, this is especially relevant to all of us around the world, with ongoing crises going on in Afghanistan and Palestine and so many other parts of the world. So this is an issue that for us really reflects the legacies of capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, and how militarism is really driving profit and destruction at the expense of human rights and safety. So we have a few minutes remaining for Q&A. So if anybody has questions, please feel free to input them into the chat. And if they're directed at any specific speaker, please identify that in your question, and we will continue the conversation from there. So the chat is open. Okay, so we have a question directed to Bhumika asking about the UN General Assembly's new agenda. Do you think it is good enough? Do you think it addresses the issues that you've raised today?
Yeah, sorry, I meant to say the UN Secretary General's report. It's called Our Common Agenda. And so he has, says, yeah, we need priority for women and girls need to be at the core. And he says, yeah, we need to, work on finance, etc. So I was just wondering if anybody from the speakers would like to comment on that. He also, of course, very much always today again talks about women's rights and gender equality. And I was wondering if any of the speakers would have comments on how to link that to the General Assembly's position and their own positions. Thanks.
I'm happy to kick it off. Sasha, thank you for asking that question. I have to confess, I've only skimmed through the Secretary General's document, but I think we can also look at the several years of history of these blueprints and roadmaps and all kinds of UN policy documents emerging from the Secretary General's office, from DESA. If we remember, immediately before the pandemic times, there was a roadmap that was released by the Secretary General Guterres, and the roadmap was very much centered on from billions to trillions. It's been more than clear in the years since the SDGs were adopted, and coming from a place where I worked very deeply on the formulation of the SDGs as what civil society was hoping back then would be a genuine paradigm shift, would really incorporate systemic international financial and trade architecture, systemic change for women's rights and human rights. And we see in the years since that it's become a very powerful vehicle for the private first agenda, for the World Bank's maximizing financing for development agenda, where it is private investment and private financing. It is the financial leveraging of ODA, and that is being seen as the savior, that is being seen as the only path for scaling up the kind of financial investments needed to achieve the SDGs. And of course, the private sector, multi-stakeholder initiatives, PPPs, the international financial institutions have all been collaborating in a kind of coordination and coherence that multilateralism can only dream of. So we see the coordination is very powerful and effective where it wants to be, right? And we see that what has really happened is this real perversion of the role of the state, a distortion of the role of the state, where it hasn't been erased or shrunk, but it has been reoriented to service the private sector, to really provide all the guarantees, the risk reductions, all the kinds of mechanisms to woo and court and attract private financing. Almost all the remarks in the LDC 5 negotiations and discussions, even from developing countries, are focused on attracting this private investment, on creating an enabling environment for private finance. So the kind of normalization and international consensus we see for the private first agenda is incredibly alarming. And yet we cannot really point the finger at developing countries, states, and governments where the global situation has been created as such, where fiscal space is more narrow than ever, and where public financing is being constrained in so many numerous ways, so that there really is no other option but private finance. So it is the scarcity of options, scarcity of choices, underpinned by ideologies, after all, the ideology to put the private sector first, to put debt repayment first, to put creditor interest first. So I think with all things related to the UN, we must see where the ideological influence is coming from, how the ideas are being shaped. We must counter the root kind of thinking in place. Thank you so much for raising this.
Thanks so much, Bhumika, for your response, and Sasha for your question. So the common agenda has also been linked to in the chat if anybody wants to check it out, and the board we've been uploaded has also been downloaded and posted in the chat. I think we have time for at least one more question. So if anybody wants to post something in the chat, please go ahead. Okay, so I'll go with the two questions that just came in. So to Bina specifically, how can feminists support the Dalit women's rights movement? And then originated from Mishy's discussion, but a question to all is that thinking about systematic bias, what are the root causes of these biases and how have they persisted for so long at a global scale? So they've mentioned that regional biases can be explained by cultural, religious reasons, but why do you think these biases are still so prevalent on a global level? Anybody who wants to take that one, please go ahead.
Bhumika, can I go?
Yeah,
Yes,
please,
yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. I think this is a really important question that we as Dalit feminists have also been grappling a lot, that oftentimes in these kind of spaces, we feel that we are excluded in a way because leadership has always been with, the women from the dominant caste. Feminism has been in India for many years now, but you may see just one woman from the community, both the indigenous community as well as the Dalit community. So I think for starters, ensure that, leadership positions are given to not just Dalit women, but, women from the marginalized communities or women from the minorities. And I think it's really important to, allyship is so important without appropriation. So how do we build that allyship? We stand together, we stand in support and solidarity without actually taking that space or without actually appropriating. It's a thin, very fine line, but I think it's important that we recognize that. And when we do engage with women from the marginalized, it's so important that we don't displace the leadership, but also stand in solidarity and as an ally. My quick thoughts, Sasha.
Thanks so much, Tina. Does anybody want to take the second question about why systematic biases against women are so strong globally? If no, that's okay. I can perhaps take a stab from my end, but it's been clear because, yeah, exactly what Shinaz has just dropped in the chat. Throughout this discussion, we've been trying to outline your comments into our Miro board and showing how these different systems of oppression, capitalism, extractivism, patriarchy, militarism, casteism, classism, and colonialism, I'm sure that I'm missing one, are all not just national and regional, but they're shared across the world, unfortunately. So it was relevant throughout all of our speaker remarks, how much these systems of oppression are present throughout the different regions that they represent, how they're not, unfortunately, they're not based at a smaller level, but they're global trends, and they continue to be exacerbated by conflicts and crises that are taking place worldwide. So I think that perhaps helps explain, unfortunately, why so many of these systematic biases are shared around the world. It's because these systems of oppression are interlinked globally. But with that, it looks like we're at time. So I really want to thank all of our speakers for their time today and for sharing their thoughtful insights. It's been, as always, a pleasure to learn from you all. So with that, I'll let you all go back, enjoy the rest of the Global People's Assembly, the UN General Assembly. I'm grateful for all of your comments, so take care and see you all soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you to our translators as well for all their hard work today.
Thank you to our translators. Thank you to
Thanks.
Janaz and Andrea for running the Miro board on the back end also.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. A wonderful session. Congrats.